Good morning to you all. My name is Bea Barraza, and I have the honor of being your guest lecture co-chair. And I want to welcome you to today's captivating, I think you've gotten a clue to that, captivating guest lecture on a woman ahead of her time and a San Diego icon, Ellen Browning Scripps, and her story of travel, art, and cultural sustainability. The lecture will be followed by a fun road trip highlighting art and travel with Catherine Jones. And this lecture is part of the San Diego Museum of Art Friday Guest Lecture Series and brought to you by the Docent Council of SDMA. So before I introduce my speaker, I just want to remind you all to stay muted during the presentation. Might help if you want to turn off your phone also. And to please take advantage of the chat function, which is available to you, to ask Dr. Doehne questions in that chat area. The questions and comments today are being curated by Mary Grillo and Katie Pence. So I want to thank you all, also all you wonderful volunteers who've made this presentation possible. To Eric Doehne, who has particularly and patiently worked with us to bring you this fascinating story of Ellen Browning Scripps. And I especially want to thank David Miles. We are all, since COVID, we've all unfortunately been separated. And because of that separation, we've really developed, I think, an appreciation for technology. How else will we be doing this? And having David Miles as co-chair makes us all grateful to have his generosity of spirit, his patience, and his intellect. And speaking of patience, I want to thank you, our audience, for hanging in with us during this crisis. Thank you for your support. So also remember, please stay tuned for the after lecture tour with Catherine Jones, docent chair, as she travels through SDMA collection and the San Diego of the early 1900s. Our speaker today is Eric Doehne. Dr. Doehne is a scientist, educator, and consultant specializing in historical materials ranging from ancient pigments to modern concrete. He studied both geology and art history and earned his Ph.D. in geochemistry with a specialization in marble. Eric lectures on art conservation at Scripps College, where he has created 6 interdisciplinary courses as part of the first undergraduate major in art conservation at a liberal arts college, attracting students who are interested in the intersection of art and science. Fascinating. He began his career with a 20-year stint as a staff scientist at the Getty Center, analyzing and diagnosing works of art for the Getty Museum and the Getty Conservation Institute. In 2012, Eric was international chair for the French Cultural Heritage Foundation, Patrimoine, which focuses on preservation. Given his background and experience, Eric is going to talk to us today about the founder of Scripps College and the force of nature behind many projects in San Diego, including her interest in cultural sustainability and museums as cultural and community spaces. I am, of course, referring to Ellen Browning Scripps. Please help me welcome Dr. Eric Doehne.
Thank you so much, Bea. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about one of my favorite subjects. Ellen Browning Scripps was a really incredible woman, born in an incredible time, born in 1836, and made it all the way through the 30s. Again, she became a very wealthy woman, but relatively late in life. She might have been worth $1 million in 2016 or something like that, but in 2026, it was more like $30 million. So it was very nonlinear, her rise to extreme wealth. And she very diligently decided to make use of those funds while she was alive. And her story is frankly a really fascinating story. And I hope you'll join me on a little time travel, a little adventure. And we're going to have a little visit to Luxor, because it's one of the places she visited that influenced her strongly. And also Venice, Italy. And she picked up on something that it took 100 years for the city of Venice to decide to address. So again, a warm welcome to everyone and to the SDMA team. And I'm going to go ahead into my presentation. And again, feel free as you listen, if there's questions that come up, type them into the chat, and our volunteer docents are going to be looking through your comments and picking out the ones that may be duplicates and sort of combining them and things like that. And we hope to get to as many of those comments and things as possible. We'll do that a couple of different times during the presentation. I'm going to be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute question and answer session as well. So this is a photograph on the upper left that you don't see very often of Ellen Browning Scripps. Most of the photographs you see are of as a 90-year-old woman, because that's when she was doing a lot of her philanthropy. But the thing that generated her wealth was her work for her brothers at the Detroit Evening News and in then later other papers, and her incredible financial acumen. She went to Knox College. She majored in science and math. She had a high school mathematics teacher that went on to be a college professor in mathematics at the University of Chicago. So she had a strong background in math and used that to look at things like how fast was a business growing and what were the profit potentials. And also, where were the pitfalls going to be, and what would there might be a cash crunch that could put the institution out of business. And she helped save her brothers on a number of occasions with cash infusions from her own savings. Okay. So here's one of the things that we do in the lecture business, especially with students, but really everybody, is we're going to tell you what we're going to tell you. We tell you, and then we tell you what you told you, right? So this is to get you a little bit oriented. One of the things that is problem with Zoom is it's very easy to get distracted. It kind of slows things down. You don't really know where you are in the talk. And so what I've done is I put the entire themes of the talk right smack up front here for you to have a look at. So the part one is really introduction, talking about art conservation, talking about Ellen being ahead of her times and why that might be, and also just some interesting tidbits about Ellen Browning Scripps, which you may not know. Maybe you've done a deep dive and maybe not. I have some people to thank as well for that, and we'll spend a brief time on that. Part two is really kind of building the case for how Ellen saw the world and how that was shaped by her experiences being confronted with ancient cultural heritage in Egypt and beautiful historic cities like Venice. But she was very perceptive. She was an incredible journalist and travel writer and columnist, and was able to reach out to ordinary people and share her experiences with them. Which had a profound influence. Anyway, I've done work in Egypt and Luxor. I spent 2 weeks there. She spent a month there. And she also traveled to Venice, Italy. And I've had a project there for a number of years working on the stone masonry conservation issues and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, the crux of the thing, from my point of view, is Ellen's brother James, who was the president of the Detroit Evening News, was a bit of a cantankerous fellow, and he wanted to be seen as an uprising gentleman, right? He wanted to be inserted into Michigan society. And so he bought his way in, like all good nouveau riche, and was one of the founding members of the Detroit Art Museum, and gave it $70,000 worth of paintings and a $50,000 endowment, which back in 1899 was worth a heck of a lot of money. Valuing what these funds were worth today is complicated. And just to let you know, I've seen estimates of the sort of peak of Ellen Browning Scripps's wealth as ranging from anywhere from $500 million in today's dollars to $3.7 billion. Consensus figure seems to be around 2.5. It's hard to say. things were just so different back then. And how do you base those calculations on? Is it like a loaf of bread, or somebody's wages, or what the economic returns would be? And there's a whole art and science to figuring out, okay, how do we translate these funds into today's context? The other tricky thing is Ellen Browning Scripps did not necessarily want people to know that she had made certain donations or commitments. And so we don't know the full extent of her philanthropy, interestingly. We're still digging through her archives at Scripps to try to understand that. And it turns out she had really bad handwriting. And she took also stenography as well. So she had a shorthand that she could use. And so her family and a number of scholars at Scripps have been plowing through her notes, her journals, her letters, and things like that, to put this on a more accessible footing for scholars. And a lot of this is now available on the Claremont Digital Library. So I encourage you all to go to the Honnold Claremont Digital Library and look at some of Ellen's writings. And you can even look at her bequest that shows, that she's gave $400,000 to the University of California to basically make the Oceanographic Institute part of the UC. The other thing on part three I want to talk about is how Ellen and James went about looking at art very differently. James really looked at it as a collector, as a trophy hunter, and brought back his trophies and donated them to the San Diego Art Museum. But in the end of his life, he was saying, Ellen, I think you were right. You were the person to invest your money the way you did, because I've really not gotten much recognition from the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I'm kind of unhappy with the way I've done my philanthropy. So that's another way Ellen was ahead of her time. And then I want to talk about education and Ellen Browning Scripps's real focus on the education of women, and how that was definitely ahead of her time. She very early on was an abolitionist and a suffragist, and invested in also a strong believer in free speech. She was a Republican early on, and supported Abraham Lincoln, in part because she went to one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates back in the day. So she was growing up when Lincoln was a country lawyer. It turns out a cousin of hers actually wrote a biography of Lincoln that may have influenced the election. So the Scripps family has just got threads in all kinds of interesting places. And that's one of the things I'd like to share with you today. And then the contrast, the approach that Ellen took in La Jolla, where she was investing in what I would call community and third places. A third place is basically not work and not home. It's libraries, it's museums, it's public squares, it's basically public spaces where people gather and can have conversation. Okay, the other thing academics do these days is we're starting to pay more attention to our forebears. And there's this great quote from Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have seen further, it's because I have stood on the shoulders of giants," meaning that the people that came before him. Now, there's some controversy about whether he was being sarcastic or not, and trying to put his friend and enemy Hook in a bind. But nonetheless, it's a great sentiment. It's rapidly, it's used all over the place. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that there were people here before the Claremont existed, and Claremont had a different name. And the best evidence of Native American occupation is on Indian Hill, not the boulevard, but the little hill in the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden there, with metates and other remnants of the village that was likely there. So most of that was gone by the time that Ellen purchased the acreage to help in the development of the Pomona colleges. But it's interesting too. The students at Scripps College and beyond really are interested in this as well. And I decided to put cultural sustainability in the title because it's a really nice umbrella concept that helps us understand how art conservation fits into this larger question of how exactly are we going to keep our cultural heritage alive? How are we going to preserve the things that we love and that we want to pass on to future generations. Excuse me. So here's an LA Times article. There's a UCLA professor who's actually teaching a class in the local language. And of course, a COVID reminder here, 16,000 deaths. This was, okay, that's the current one. And then this is, let's see, this is from the Pomona College. It's a blog entry from the Pomona Farm talking about a petition to change the name of Indian Hill Boulevard, the one that runs through Claremont and whatnot, to Tongva Hill Boulevard. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but anyway. So the students are very much aware of this inheritance that they have from the past and how it's been sort of deliberately forgotten. And they're interested in acknowledging it in different ways. And so it's not uncommon if you're in Australia or Europe now that somebody will have sort of a moment of silence and say, hey, let's remember the ancestors that were here before us. And in many cases in North America, they left behind, because of smallpox, empty villages and rows of grain and basically an abandoned garden rather than a jungle. We tend to think of North America, oh my gosh, it's this dark jungle, but really it was an abandoned garden. And again, because of the incredible devastation of the native populations, particularly from smallpox. Here's another article from the local student newspaper. Again, student interest in this is high. And also this connects to food issues and sustainability. And it's really got the students thinking about, okay, well, what lessons can we learn from these Native Americans? How did they manage to sustain themselves for, 1,500 years in this area? Okay, back to our Zoom. And if you are one of our Zoom participants, please type in the chat. And I want you to pay attention in particular to these a couple of questions here. Hang on a sec. Okay. All right. So one of the questions is cultural sustainability versus environmental sustainability. How do you think the two relate? So I put that in my title, and most people have not heard of cultural sustainability. The use of the phrase environmental sustainability is probably 10 to 100 times greater than the term cultural sustainability. But I'll give you an example. I had a student talking about the medieval city of Riga in Latvia and what an important place it was, and preservation issues and this, that, and the other. And I was saying, well, what's the elevation of Riga? And he says, oh, it's between 3 and 30 feet above sea level. And I was like, okay, by 2100, at least, maybe 2050, you're going to have to move Riga. And here is this ancient city with these incredible masonry buildings. And at the very least, they're going to have to be jacked up. We do have the technology to do that. You could just jack them up in place. A little bit like out of the James Bond movie, Casino Royale, with all those inflatable things. And then the second question is, I want you to think about, as an audience, what some of your earliest memories where you had a strong sense of place, where you would like actually your grandchildren to have that experience or your children to have that experience, and you want it to be around in 2050, let's say, or 2100. And then I want you to think about, okay, well, how do you sustain that? How do you make sure that that's going to happen? And I pointed out to the students that we do not currently have a giant infrastructure project to relocate cities, let alone historic cities, because of rising sea levels. But their generation, this is going to be a huge issue for them. And so one of the things that the Ellen Browning Scripps's lawyer did when she developed Scripps College was to emphasize that, hey, Scripps should be taking risks and it should be trying out new fields of endeavor. And so the art conservation major and the focus on heritage science is absolutely one of those fields that Scripps is investigating on the new side. Okay, so think about those. And then what is this talk about? Well, it's really thinking about, well, how do you become a woman ahead of your time? And related to that, okay, she was investing in cultural sustainability and from the argument that I'm trying to make. So what exactly is cultural sustainability? And we'll get to that in a second. But first of all, I have a sort of a hope for this lecture, and I hope you'll participate with me. And it's really about wanting to convince you that cultural sustainability is at least as important in many cases as environmental sustainability. And yet it's got much less attention. We don't really have the vocabulary for it. But especially during COVID, it's predicted by the United Nations that up to a third of museums in existence now may have to close permanently. So we are going to lose a huge fraction of our history. These are going to be little local historical societies as well as significant museums. The Museum Association has already decided to relax its deaccession policies to help museums through this difficult time. And of course, that's created lots of controversies about what ends up getting deaccessioned and whether that's okay, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to get into that. Okay. All right. Okay. So now here's some definitions, right? So if we think about, in simple terms, we think about cultural sustainability, environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and then where they overlap, right? So if you have cultural and economic sustainability, you have an equitable society. And if you have the environment and the economic, maybe you have a viable society. If you just have the culture and the environment, it might be bearable, but you don't have much economic, then that's an issue. So there's this little sweet spot here in the center that they're calling sustainable, which I think is interesting. So, okay. The other definitions here, again, these vary wildly depending on who you're talking to. But if we think of culture as a set of beliefs and morals, methods, traditions, these kinds of things, and it really depends on passing it down to future generations, right? This is one of the reasons churches bring in young people and train them and go through rituals and things like that. And of course, sustainability is simply just, are we going to be able to sustain or continue what it is that we're actually doing? Okay, just to double check, can everyone hear me okay? I need a
Yes,
thumbs up.
yes, yes.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. Thank you so much. All right, next. I thought this quote from a professor down at SDSU was really nice. This is how he summed up her life in one sentence. How a woman's pragmatic yet free-spirited generosity greatly enhanced the region by privileging social justice over personal gain, meaning that the institutions that she set up were accessible by anyone. And that's changed over time, but in general, that was her approach. And then I've got a bunch of little tidbits in here that are fascinating that sort of remind you why she was such a fascinating person. She literally was one of the first newspaper columnists. For a while, she was writing 5 to 7 days a week, a column in her brother's paper, the Detroit Evening News. And a little bit later in life, she got interested in La Jolla and interesting things that were going on in that time. And one of them was meditation and yoga and science, right? And she helped found the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. She absolutely devoured books. Her father was a bookbinder, and she was constantly going to many lectures, and she really enjoyed those as a way of enjoying the conversation and getting conversations going about a particular topic. She was way ahead of her time in thinking about mental health of all things. Um, we don't, it's only recently that we've sort of realized, hey, actually going to the beach or the mountains and getting away from it all and doing something physical is really good for your mental health. And it's roughly the equivalent of taking a Prozac. So if you don't want to take a Prozac and you're depressed, if you go for a hike or go to the beach, and she really understood that in a fundamental way, which I thought was really interesting. Ellen Browning Scripps was also very strongly influenced by the arts and crafts preservationists, in particular William Morris in the UK, John Ruskin, who wrote lovingly about ruins and wanting to try to preserve things in a moment in time and not necessarily do a fancy restoration. And this was in opposition to a famous French restorer of antiquities named Violette de Duc, who actually added back some of the bizarre gargoyles on Notre Dame because it didn't meet his expectation of what a medieval building should look like. So a lot of debate about authenticity and what makes sense. Okay, this is what I'm, excuse me, not going to talk about. In the world, we've just got a lot of controversy, and in particular over LACMA. And so sometimes people look at the museum world and they see just a lot of egos. But one of the things I've noticed a lot in museums, especially during COVID, and even before in the last few years, more and more are being run by women, and more are being run with an eye towards providing the museum as a town square where people can come, people of any stripe can come and learn and debate and talk and have an experience. So one of the questions I really got interested in when I was researching Ellen Browning Scripps, and her presence is all over the Scripps campus, of course, is this notion people kept telling me, wow, gosh, Ellen Browning Scripps is really ahead of her time. And I was like, well, how does that happen? I mean, not that many people are ahead of their time, and sometimes they get executed on the rack, right? If you're a little too ahead of your time. So what happened to her? And one of the things that was fascinating was to delve into all of her travel writings. She wrote 100 columns about her trips to Europe mainly, but also North Africa, Mexico, all over the place. She was set to go to Japan, had to cancel at the last minute. She was a real traveler, especially later in life, from like 1881 to 1897, as really when her travels took off. So the writing, in combination with the travel, she produced 1,000 pages of typewritten letters of her experience. What was life like in Italy? What was life like for the average person in Egypt, for example? She stayed away from politics and was very concerned with, again, what was going on in everyday people. Okay, so let's move on. So this is, you may be asking, who is Eric Doehne and why is there an art conservation at Scripps? And interestingly, the lawyer of Ellen Browning Scripps, who was on the board, who was the chairman of the board of trustees for Scripps College for 10 years and helped implement her ideas as Scripps was growing, one of the things he said was Scripps should really experiment and it should endeavor to explore new fields. And so one of the things I love about art conservation is it's incredibly interdisciplinary. You can be a microbiologist and find out, oh, I'm really interested in Ladisco Cave and all the microbes are eating away at it. You can be an artist and interested in your artist materials and how they were traditionally used, how to grind pigment and things like that. You can be a project manager and realize, oh my gosh, we've got flash flooding coming through this archaeological site, and we need to do X, Y, and Z to help prevent damage to that. And so these are some of the courses that I teach. I teach about one a semester. And right now I'm teaching global tourism, climate change, and world heritage preservation. That's again focused on the natural, the cultural world heritage, not necessarily let's say Yosemite, for example. The newest course is one on digital preservation. It turns out digital technologies are one of the most rapidly evolving fields in conservation. It's really getting hard to find old tape players and things like that. So digitizing things and trying to make them more widespreadly available, application of science technology to those kinds of issues. You know, people have ambitions of doing things like putting every single photograph, historic photograph ever taken in one big database and geolocate them all, and being able to do a little time travel and go back and see, okay, what did this view look like, 50, 100, 200, 300 years from now? Use paintings as well, that kind of thing. So it's exciting. I've really enjoyed putting all these together, and a lot of them are based on my Getty experiences. Again, I was a conservation scientist / heritage scientist for 22 years. With the Getty, and I continue to do consulting. But I've worked on the Getty Kuros, I've worked on the Sistine Chapel, I've worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've worked on the Late Holy Footprints. Chinese caves in Mogao. I mean, I'm a little unusual in that I have both museum and field experience, archaeological and architectural experience. Most people tend to specialize. And I'm here to advocate for a little bit more of the role of the generalist, because I think that's what's important when you're dealing with an interdisciplinary field like this. So here's an example of a little blurb for the classes being taught next semester on cultural landscape preservation. So this is things like that don't necessarily fit easily into art or architecture or archives. Again, sense of place. The Fowler Garden is absolutely gorgeous and one of the most beautiful places on a beautiful campus, used a lot for weddings and things like that as well. But it's also a very spiritual place. So here's Martinez working on his garden. And here's a little bit more about me. I've authored a book called Stone Conservation, an overview of current research. It's available as a free PDF from the Getty. And I've been working on things like the deterioration problems of places like Karnak and the Alamo, which are both World Heritage sites. So World Heritage preservation is one of the themes of the talk. And again, you might be wondering, what the heck is art conservation and heritage science? How do we look at that? And this is, our niche has really got these different tracks of practice and management. If we come down here, again, research could be looking at Nazi looted art or scientific research, that kind of thing. So one of the things I really love about it is all applied. It's applied science, it's applied history. You have to make decisions about this stuff. And so the students really identify with it, and we've got a growing cadre of people taking these courses. So again, if you think about the scope of material culture, visual culture, but now that's expanded into things like natural and cultural sites that are mixed, tangible and intangible cultural heritage, things like cuisine, are now on the World Heritage List, and now they've announced digital heritage is on the World Heritage List. So we're going to try to save the very best digital heritage that's out there. As you may know, it gets harder and harder to work with older and older files. And of course, the 3 A's I have up here don't necessarily fit that well with things like heritage landscapes and heritage studies as well. So this is, again, to come back to the outline, and just to point out, we're getting here close to start up about her travels. But first, she taught school for 3 years, went to college for 3 years, and then taught school again, a one-room schoolhouse, for 8 years. And what was interesting is her high school math teacher, her high school teacher was a mathematician who later went on to become a professor at the University of Chicago. And when she got to Knox College, she studied science and mathematics primarily. And so she really had a good head for figures. And that came in very handy when she was trying to figure out how fast are the institutions I'm involved in, these newspapers, how fast are they growing? How fast are they becoming profitable? And she saw early on that they were becoming incredibly profitable, and kept investing more and more of her own money in these, and both to help her brothers, but also to build her own fortune. So some questions and answers, let's see, about Ellen Browning Scripps. Okay, I have this photograph is a little too big here, so let me move that back. There we go. Okay. So one of the things that Ellen really did a lot of was trying to make life a little better for other people. She was very much involved in the care of her younger siblings and the care of her father as he was dying, the care of other close relatives. So family was really important to her. This was kind of the founding motto for Scripps College. Again, think clearly and independently, and the ability to live confidently, courageous, and hopefully. And at first this sounds a little bit trite maybe, but if you really parse it down, as a French professor at Scripps has done, she's got a fabulous article just on this one phrase of sort of breaking it down. It really is a powerful statement, and means a lot. And Ellen was greatly influenced by the volunteer work that happened during World War I, where women really got together and did stuff for the war effort and that empowered them. She was really pushing for the suffragettes and also emancipation of the slaves. So a little known fact that she attended one of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates while she was at Knox College, and that really helped shape her longstanding interest in politics and free speech. So again, very interesting woman and definitely worthy of our attention. So this is a bit of a timeline, just to sort of give you the sense. Again, born in 1836 in London, again, finally moved to the United States. So she has an English accent. Again, moves to Detroit to help her brother with the evening news, also Cincinnati Press, Cincinnati Post. She did a lot of traveling in the decade of the 1881 to 1889. There was a residue of an economic depression. At that point, things were coming back, and so it was a really interesting time to be alive, for sure. She also traveled to places like Cuba and Mexico and the Near East, and so she spent a month in Egypt. I got to spend 2 weeks. So it's interesting to see how these influenced her. And again, in connection with people like her brothers and things like that, she decided to move out to La Jolla, and she did things like she discovered there was a whole bunch of like-minded women there, and she organized the La Jolla Women's Club. That's one of the first things that she worked on there. So here's the timeline a little bit later, and her house burned down after a fire. There was a dispute apparently between the cook and a laborer, and the laborer got drunk and set her house on fire. And she, really mourned the things that she lost. Luckily, the library survived. Some furniture survived. But one of the things she decided to do when she was making donations later in life was insist on fireproof buildings, meaning not built out of wood, but built out of brick, basically, really substantial buildings. And this was in opposition to her brother, who was much more like, let's just build it cheap. But not Ellen, because she had really suffered at the hands of a fire that was deliberately set. I guess I want to point out too here, the 1919 funds the Egyptian Exploration Society, and this formed the nucleus of the collection in the San Diego Museum of Us now, and you can go and see that as well. She commissioned, again, a number of important books about wildflowers and natural history. She was a big proponent of enjoying the natural world, going to the beach, going to the mountains, going horseback riding, as a way of keeping your mental health. And she was an early understander and advocate for this sort of nature nurture connection in how well people function is partly a function of how much they're out in nature. So here's the commitment for 12 years. She gave this. She basically brought Egypt to San Diego. So it's pretty exciting. This is towards the end of her life. People don't realize that she only had like $1 million in 1916. The vast majority of her fortune built up. I think by 1926, she had $30 million. Because of the increase in the value of the stock. Finally, advertisers were ponying up, and people were paying a little bit more than a penny, and these became profitable. And again, it's a really fascinating story, and she accomplished so much in her last decade that's really extraordinary. Of course, the key one for me, founding Scripps College. And this is just to give you an idea of what her normal day was like for like 15 years when she first started for the Detroit Evening News and needed to make a success. Her brother James basically hired a bunch of family members and paid them a pittance or paid them in stock. And so she was there at the office at 7 a.m. She worked as a editor, as a proofreader, copy editor, columnist, and feature writer. She did all of these different things. And again, he estimated, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Ellen traded childcare and helping with the cooking and things like that for free rent. So she was able to reinvest a lot of her money in her brother's newspapers. Okay, so we're back here, and now we're going to shift a bit more towards part two and Ellen's travel. And from my point of view, her really far-seeing take on the significance of cultural heritage as opposed to simply an art trophy. So here's the gang of characters here. The youngest brother of the family. So Ellen Scripps had many siblings, daughters and brothers. These were the two most influential in her life. And James, again, was the powerhouse behind the Detroit Evening News. E.W. Scripps was more involved in networks of newspapers, and he established the UPI. So James liked to think of himself as a gentleman come bad boy, and hated advertisers, carried a gun, attacked the elites, and was focused on trying to get penny newspapers into the hands of the working class. So again, Ellen Scripps wrote this column called Ellen's Miscellany, and she's widely considered one of the first newspaper columnists and one of the first foreign correspondents as well for all of her letters. Her again, 1,000-page of letters that she sent to her brothers to publish, which were very popular. Okay. So one of the turning points in Ellen Browning Scripps's life was she was able to go to Europe, and I want to show you some slides from that. She talked about being so excited; it was all one glorious prospect, and they were going to North Africa, they were going to Italy, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to talk briefly about Egypt. The thing I wanted you to get from this is some quotes from Bruce Kamerling's article on how Ellen brought Egypt to San Diego. She became a horseback rider. Who knew? An incredible horseback rider, surpassing men in the group. She decided, hey, it's really important to have proper scientific excavations here, and she funded those. She thought that was important. She was appalled at the degradation of the number of the sites that they visited. And again, she was upset about the forgeries that were being produced. She was saying that hardly a person in this area aren't turning out antiquities by the thousands at Luxor for the tourists, and that if you're going to learn anything, it had to be learned through science and careful observation and recording and documentation. And so she thought, okay, this is something that needs to be funded. And interestingly, she said in an offhand way, I'm not that interested in archaeology. What I'm interested in is the digging part anyway. What I'm interested in is how archaeology can be used for education, which I think is really interesting. Okay, all right, I'm going to skip this one and we'll just go right on to the Museum of Us in Balboa Park. And these are some of the objects that she was able to accumulate from her membership in this group. There's something called portage, where host countries would sell would share some of the discoveries with the people who had actually done the excavation. So now these are some slides from Luxor. We're running a little bit late, and I will finish up here shortly. And we're going to move from Scripps College over to Egypt. So we've got about 10 more minutes left. We're now zooming up on Karnak Temple in Luxor. And so this is where the boats go up the Nile, meaning south in this case. And you can just barely see Luxor Temple here with this long avenue and lots of statues and things like that. If we go down, we can see here's the statues and columns, and there's the obelisk here. This is the obelisk that Napoleon could not remove. He didn't have the technology, so he left it. So he took the smaller one that was near it and put that in the Place de la Concorde, which is not actually doing very well. So there's some repatriation negotiations between France and Egypt, and it's not clear they're going to go anywhere. But nonetheless, I find it fascinating that the ancient Egyptians had technology that Napoleon didn't have. These are my slides here. They're just beautiful West Bank area from the Nile. Here's an aerial looking at all the tourist buses outside of Karnak. And you may see these sort of funny rows back here. And these funny rows are concrete platforms in order to put all of the debris from the destruction of this Karnak temple and keep them from being eaten away by salty groundwater. And that's one of my areas of expertise as a geologist, is how to help take care of this stone. Luxor's got a lovely dry climate. You can see here, this is probably what Ellen saw with these statues up to their chests in sand. And this is what they look like today. It turns out tagging was an issue even in 1831 here on ancient monuments. And security guards are often out there today trying to prevent people from doing stupid things like knocking their selfie sticks on these 5,000-year-old surfaces and things like that. So here's the famous obelisk, and I do a close-up there, and it just looks like it was cut by a laser, even though we know exactly how it was carved. It was carved with a harder stone. But there's so little rain in Luxor that the preservation is really extraordinary. So this is the Avenue of the Sphinxes, and towards the very end of this, there is a new library that was put in by Mubarak's wife. And she decided, while I was there, that she didn't have enough of these sculptures in front of the library. So these are a couple thousand years old sculptures at least. And so one morning they got the sort of backhoe out and moved them down closer to the Mubarak library. So at that moment I knew, oh, this country is ripe for revolt. This was 2010, and with Arab Spring came the next year. And I have to say, I was not surprised. The abuse of power by the elites, the lack of opportunity for everyday Egyptians. It's a complicated place. That said, they're highly dependent on tourism. So I hope you will enjoy some tourism there at some point when you feel like it's safe. Okay, one of the reasons I was there was to come up with better ways of removing some of these salt crusts that have accumulated in the stone and in the plasters and things like that at Karnak. So here we have a conservator working with me, and we're testing out a couple of different poultices. Here we are in the laboratory testing out different materials as well, trying to understand what was going to work best, a simple paper poultice or something with some mud in it. And it turns out that the mud had much higher suction and was able to get the salts out of it. Here we have some iconoclasm. You can see the faces have been removed here on these. This is the Temple of Karnak. And I love these National Geographic reconstructions. Here it really shows you what this must have looked like with a wooden roof. And if you go and clean the surface today, here's 50 years worth of dust storms coming up. But this is actually these beautiful colors that come to life when you clear away that. And if you're in a sheltered area, you can see spectacular preservation, 5,000-year-old preservation that just takes your breath away. So if you haven't been to Egypt, I highly recommend it. And it's really an important place to Ellen Browning Scripps. Like I said, she spent a month there, and she developed some of these strong opinions about, oh, okay, and forgeries of antiquities, and how do we deal with that? How do we prevent tourists from just buying up this garbage? And then also understanding the power of Egypt and how it can take people back in time, and it can help educate people as to history and its importance. And if you have an object in front of you, you're much more likely to understand and to partake of that. Okay, so we've got a very quick trip to Italy, and I just wanted to mention that Ellen Browning Scripps, one of the first things she wrote about Italy was the problems of the pigeons, and she really didn't like the pigeons there. And the fun thing is that, let's see, I'm going to double check something here and start this up again. Okay. 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 All right. So here we go. There's a little video clip, much more recent. You might have to turn the sound up.
A view eclipsed for some by the local flying residents. Offering a tasty tidbit is a quick way to make friends.
We're not seeing the video.
Okay, hang on a sec. I see it's paused. Okay, let me start over again here. Okay, let me give this a try now. Okay, almost there. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Sharing is paused. Bring their sharing window to the front. So it is to the front. Zoom share. Let's see. Okay, now it should be seeing. Okay, can you hear the sound?
The splendour of St. Mark's
And the
Square
video.
in Venice. A view eclipsed for some by the local flying residents.
Yes, we
Offering a
can.
tasty tidbit is a quick way to
US?
make friends. Few seem to realise that their carefree
Yeah,
act of
it's
kindness
working.
is a criminal
Okay, good.
offence.
Yeah? Yeah? There is no sign of that we shouldn't give food for the pigeon. I don't know why. No one told us that.
By feeding the pigeons, you could land yourself a stiff €500 fine. In practice, the police are staying tolerant for the moment. Giving a bit of your sandwich is okay, but watch out if you start throwing grain around. Last year, 350,000 kilograms of grain were fed to the pigeons in the square. The city mayor felt he had to step in to safeguard public health, as well as Venice's unique heritage. Since May, the traditional grain sellers have been chased off the square, all 18 of them.
I'm lucky that I'd already worked 40 years, and if everything goes well, next year I'll get my pension. But my colleagues who chose to get another job in exchange haven't seen anything yet.
Those who opted for financial compensation haven't received anything either, although the mayor is promising €80,000 each. While the grain sellers might be out of work, others see Venice's pigeon clampdown as cause for celebration.
The pigeon population has gone down. Today we've only got several thousand pigeons, whereas before we had some 20,000 in the square.
And it is more and more difficult to find a nest under the Venetian eaves. The pigeons seem to be getting the message at last, leaving the flocks of tourists to enjoy the city's delights instead.
Okay. So again, another example, I think, of Ellen being ahead of her time. In the upper right here, here's where she's talking about the her experience in Venice. And again, these were really oriented towards sort of everyday activities and things that her audience of working class people in Detroit would be interested in. So she wasn't going around like her brother and say, oh, that's the oldest painting in town, or that's the most beautiful painting in town. She was saying, oh, well, here's what it's like to be in the the Piazza San Marco and have this experience. I think that it's really exciting. So again, Venice is at the center of a lot of research right now and understanding and trying to figure out, okay, are we going to have to jack up the buildings 30 feet for it to survive climate change? The number of Venetians is decreasing dramatically from 300,000 to like 50,000. So are we going to have Venice without the Venetians and their traditions? So lots of interesting discussions about that, to the point where I've really written a course on this, and that's what we're learning about right now. I call it Global Tourism, Climate Change, and World Heritage Preservation, where we look at the intersection of these three things and what is likely to happen going forward, and which are the most vulnerable. There's already a little island out in the middle of the Chesapeake that's eroding quickly and has its own dialect. It's been out there for 220 years, and they've been lobstermen, and now they need a seawall if they're going to survive. It's 13 miles from the shore, smack in the middle of the Chesapeake. So there's lots and lots of interesting issues. And my students are going to have to get really good at things like, how do we move New Orleans somewhere, where it's 30 feet taller at least, the entire city, and still keep its culture? There exists no government agency to do that. And yet I feel like I'm helping to train some of the beginning students in understanding these fundamental issues and presenting them to them as kind of generational, millennial challenges. Here's a dashboard for Venice that helps it make it clear, okay, international tourist arrivals today, 24,000 people. And just to contrast that, Ellen's favorite tourist destination in Germany was the town of Spa, where people would go for rest cures and things like that. Beautiful place. She liked beautiful places. And they got so many people, they got 20,000 people a year, okay, in Spa. And that was considered a lot. She said it was crowded. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the magnitude of what Venice is dealing with 24,000 people per day. Again, tourism is a totally different world than it used to be. Here we have the tides and we have the declining population of Venice, lots of interesting data there. Just recently, the Mosa system was finally demonstrated to work. They had a high water event. They put up the Mosa gates, and they were able to keep the tides from flooding the city there. So that's some good news. That said, it's the metal is being eaten by marine organisms and microbes and things like that. And so it looks like the lifespan of the Mosa system or its maintenance is going to be terribly problematic, in large part because Italy's not very interdisciplinary, shall we say, to be delicate. And so there was no microbiologist, marine microbiologist on the engineering team to build these things. So they had no idea that these things were going to be zapped. Okay, so that's a quick look at Luxor and Venice. And now we're going to go on to this question of James and Ellen and art and the contrasting appreciations, and then some of the things that Ellen has done to create such a wonderful community in Scripps and La Jolla. In San Diego and La Jolla. So basically, Ellen was in the process of creating what I would call third spaces. So a women's club, a beach, the Torrey Pines Reserves. She was creating spaces that weren't home, they weren't work, they were somewhere else you could go to get recharged. It might, be a cafe, it might be a hospital, might be a museum, that kind of thing. But she really, really invested in tourism, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And so her brother, however, was kind of a social climber, really wanted entree into the upper echelons of society in Detroit. And so he became one of the founders of the Detroit Art Institutes and gave $50,000 in cash and another $75,000 in art to get the thing going. But in the end of his life, he was disappointed. He actually liked Ellen's approach better of trying to build a community and community values into the institutions that she had created. And he really didn't get that much recognition from the Detroit Art Institute, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so again, James bought a whole bunch of old masters, 70, both in Italy and in Paris, to donate to the new museum. And there's an amusing story of how his purchases soon spread without Tuscany, calling him to be beset by everyone who had a picture to sell or knew someone who did. So he apparently got a little carried away in Florence. And by the time he got back to Detroit, some of the members of the board of trustees for the museum were not wanting to accept one of his paintings because of rumors that they might be forgeries. And ironically, one of the more popular exhibits that the Detroit Art Institute has done is to focus on some of the fakes in their collections or misattributions in their collections. It's a really enjoyable exhibit. I don't know if anybody's seen it. Okay, so we're down here now, and now we're going to want to talk a little bit about education and Scripps, wrap it up, and then we'll do a Q&A. So here's a little bit of then and now. Ellen Browning Scripps' house is now the La Jolla Museum of Contemporary Art. And again, this notion of not work, not home. We've got third spaces: schools, museums, cultural institutions, the beach, hospitals, research institutions, and again, and many more. A lot of her philanthropy was not recorded. She did not want her name associated with it. But the dozen or so that she herself really founded are these. And one of the things that I hadn't realized was that the Scripps Research Institute is now the largest nonprofit biomedical research organization, yes, with thousands of employees. Really fascinating out there. Okay, she also got on Time magazine because of her creation of Scripps College. Not that many people have enough money to establish an entire college. So that gives you a little idea of the funds that she had available. But she made many other investments. Asilomar, she gave land for that. San Diego Zoo built a big aviary. Unfortunately, in 1926, Ellen was smack in the middle of establishing Scripps College, which is when the San Diego Museum of Art was being established. So you can't do everything. And so there's less of a connection, interestingly, between Ellen and the SD than you might expect. Nevertheless, she helped establish the La Jolla Art Association, and there were many, many painters in La Jolla that joined this, 60 to a couple hundred, depending on what year. And they formed this eucalyptus, or it was just kind of the derogatory term, but a lot of people use the term California Impressionism. And I think you can absolutely see that in this painting by Maurice Braun of Mission Valley. Certainly Mission Valley has changed a bit. Again, a member of the Detroit Art Association, La Jolla Art Association that Ellen Browning Scripps helped to establish. So one of the things I want to point out that why Ellen was so far ahead of her time is she really focused on the status of women and wanting to provide strong educational opportunities for them. So she created the Bishop School, which is again a feeder school to prominent East Coast schools. And that was fairly early on. And then much later, and not that long before her death, she established Scripps College as part of the Claremont colleges out, tearing off of Pomona College and sharing a library and things like that. So here's that vision being built. And we have sort of a general map: Harvey Mudd at the top, Pitzer to the right, Scripps in the middle, Claremont McKenna down here, and Pomona a little bit from this to the south. So she really felt this was her pride and joy, her crowning achievement. Here's a wonderful mural by Alfredo Ramos Martinez that we have at Scripps that was not finished. And because it's not finished, it makes it a fabulous teaching tool. So that's something that I really enjoy from all of that. Again, the crowning achievement was Scripps College. And just a little bit more about her. Why should we be curious about her? Well, she was in support of women's education, free speech, women's suffrage, temperance also. Her brother was an alcoholic and not real happy about that. She really got interested in science in college and in high school and math, and never left that. And just read voraciously on that. And a number of these comments are coming from Patricia and her biography of the Scripps family. So now we're at the end, and I thank you for staying with us with the technical glitch, but we're back a little on track, and we have some time for just a couple of brief conclusions and a Q&A. And one of the things I want you guys to think about is we're in a new Gilded Age today with vast differences in income inequality issues. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, well, who is today's Ellen Browning Scripps? And the one that came to mind to me, and I'm very curious to see if you have other examples, is Lauren Powell Jobs, the widow of the late Steve Jobs. So she's an heiress, she's a businesswoman, she's an executive, she's been working all kinds of interesting projects over her life. She's focused on educational reform, social redistribution, and environmental conservation. Gee, that sounds like Ellen Browning Scripps. Again, preparing disadvantaged high school students for college and managing a $19 billion trust and figuring out what the heck to do with that. So in conclusion, I hope I've argued that cultural sustainability is a really important bridge to our future. It's not as popular a concept right now as environmental sustainability, but I am arguing that it is absolutely critical to get us from where we are now to where we want to go. In many cases, polar bears are not a great symbol of climate change. You know, maybe the Eiffel Tower is, about to fall over kind of thing. I think cultural heritage in some ways is more at threat in some respects in certain circumstances. And it's one of the things that I think can help motivate people to deal with climate change. And then the other thing that Ellen did that was very clever is she didn't invest in art. Now, I should qualify that. She cleaned her own house well into her 70s and early 80s, I think, but she had a private librarian. Right? So that's a woman with her priorities straight. I got a ton of books in my house. I would love to have a private librarian. She ordered a box a week of books from New York that arrived. She subscribed to 61 publications in her 80s. And so again, absolutely voracious reader and incredibly well rounded and ahead of her time, because she was investing in things like creating knowledge, like the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, which is something of an homage to her brothers. Opportunities for education, especially for women, Bishop School, Scripps College. And then again, fostering a love of art and nature. This is something I think that's incredibly important in that Ellen was really ahead of her time in understanding things like mental health and making sure that people had time outdoors. They either went to the beach or went to the mountains, did some hiking, but that sort of being out in nature to her was very much tied in with mental health. And she talked a lot mental health in interesting ways that we would recognize today as absolutely ahead of her time. And that importance of integrating mental health with physical health and surrounding you with a beautiful environment. It's one of the reasons why Scripps College is one of the most beautiful colleges in the United States. It's on the National Register. And Ellen Browning Scripps very, very much wanted to have a beautiful place so that it would seep into the students' bones and they would develop a love of beautiful places. And again, I want to make sure I am not a Scripps scholar per se. I am a conservation scientist / art conservation professional. And I just found this whole rabbit hole quite fascinating. And the sources for a lot of the quotes that you see, again, Molly McLean and Patricia Shaishlin, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, are her biographers. And Bruce Kamerlang talks about how Ellen brought Egypt to San Diego. And then, of course, my own colleagues and the library at Scripps that has all of her travel letters. The travel letters are absolutely fascinating. They show a woman both ahead of her time, but also of her time as well. So I encourage you to have a look at some of those as well. So again, special thanks to the entire team, San Diego Museum of Art, That's been a great experience for me. And here we have a little sunset from La Jolla. And then lastly, this is a fundraiser. We need your help. There's a report that's come out that in Europe anyway, they're expecting 1/3 of museums to close permanently. And so we need your help. And so I hope you will donate here and help the San Diego Museum of Art continue in its wonderful mission of bringing so many world treasures to such a wonderful and diverse audience. I think the San Diego Museum of Art has definitely approached its mission as a town hall and not just an elitist place where expensive works of art get donated. It doesn't feel that way at all. And so in some ways it embodies that aspect of Ellen Browning Scripps of focusing on the community and the communitarian aspects of all these things. And I do hope you will stay tuned for a virtual tour of some of the places that Ellen loved. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Eric. My name's Mary Grillo, and I will be, Katie Bentz and I are handling any questions that may come in. So if you have questions, please enter them into the chat room. We have a few to start off with. And our first question is, how can museums today address historical racism while still fostering an appreciation of the art that may reinforce that racism or concepts of racism?
Absolutely. And people have been wrestling this both in the conservation profession and the curatorial profession. And I think there are two tools that they use that can be very helpful for addressing this. And one is the context, providing more context of the work in its situation. I'll give you an example. The Norton Simon of lack of context. Norton Simon has some artworks on its walls that are Nazi looted art. And everyone agrees they were looted by the Nazis. But because of statute of limitations and having to follow Dutch law instead of American law, the family that was trying to get these objects back from the Norton Simon lost. And yet there's no mention on the plaques of these objects at the Norton Simon. And I think that's a real missed opportunity. I think they need to give that context and provide and say, okay, this is the way it worked out. But we're not going to ignore the issue. We're going to say, this is a serious issue and it's a complicated issue, and let's educate you about it. Let's not ignore it. So I think greater context about the origins of these works of art. A number of the works of art that James Scripps donated, the Board of Trustees basically refused and said, we think those are fakes. And interestingly, 100 years later, there was an exhibit of fakes at the Detroit Institute for Arts, and it was one of the most popular exhibits they've had ever. People were fascinated by having fakes like that. The other tool I think that's helpful in situations like this, and again, I'm not a curator, is significance, and trying to decide what is the significance of this work. Is it in its values? Is it in its technology? Is it in its innovation? And there's all these different complicated values that art expresses, right? Is it mainly famous because it provoked a bunch of people and therefore it was famous? And so the Australians are really good at writing up the significance of their cultural heritage. And they've had to wrestle with a lot of Aboriginal issues and relating their culture and into the mainstream with Australian culture. I think they've been relatively successful with that and respecting and forming a new relationship with their native population. And so I think if you combine those two, again, respect for the context, and realize that, let's say, for example, Ellen Browning Scripps was a woman of her time as well as being ahead of her time. And again, the focus on significance and what is really important here, and tying it to other stories, not just viewing an object in isolation, but realizing culture is part of a system. It's like an operating system, or it's a complex adaptive system. There's all kinds of different ways of describing culture, but I think those two things can help. But again, I'm not an expert.
Thank you.
So here's another question here. Throughout history, civilizations have built on top of generation after generation. And one of the effects is the destruction of artifacts and locations of traditional ceremonies because it becomes outdated, yet it also becomes more valuable after more time. So what practices should be in place to protect cultural arts and traditions in situ while honoring the present?
That's a great question, and there's a whole bunch of experiments going on about that. A nice example is up in the Pacific Northwest, where Native Americans are creating totem pole sculptures for sale to tourists, but they're also creating totem pole sculptures for their own tribal needs and expression. And there's been a lot of support from anthropologists and who are documenting all of this, and who are trying to encourage this and establish a market for totem poles so that we don't lose the ability to make them, that it's not just simply a way of, well, it's just you're just collectors now, and yeah, there's only 100 totem poles left and you've got the rarest one, good for you. But actually encouraging current artists to take their ancestors' cultural heritage and cultural practices and reinvent them now. In such a way that it's meaningful, but you're adapting it and you're looking forward. Ellen Scripps was very much of a person who wanted to look forward, but lend a helping hand. There's a great quote from her where she says something along those lines of to sort of caution EJ when he was in one of his depressive moods. So, I think that's one of the ways of thinking about this stuff. Did I answer the question?
I think you did, yeah, thank you. And I just want to thank you also for providing this guest lecture for the San Diego Museum of Art. We really appreciate having you. And I want to encourage everyone that's still on that to stay tuned, because we now are going to get treated to a Zoom docent-led tour of some of the works of art in our museum by Catherine Jones, who's the president of the Docent Council. And she's going to be taking us on a road trip around San Diego to some of the iconic places that Ellen Browning Scripps was influential, and how it inspired artists in San Diego and abroad to create some beautiful works of art that are on display in our museum. So Catherine, take it away.
You'll have to unmute yourself.
I thought David was running my...
And I am. Are you ready for your slides?
Thank you.
Here we go.
I went to Dignity Health to get some initial diagnosis and
how's that?
That's perfect.
Excuse me, can I interrupt 1 second? There's someone with their audio on, and we have someone talking in the background. Could everyone except Catherine please mute?
I hope it's not my daughter. It might be. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Catherine, and welcome to the San Diego Museum of Art After Lecture Tour. I hope you enjoyed Eric's lecture, and I noticed that I may be repeating some of it, but let's just call it positive reinforcement. And even though Miss Ellen lived in La Jolla, next slide, she made a lot of trips around San Diego, And I think my tour for you today just screams road trip. Next slide. Okay, today we're going to do some time traveling back to the early part of the 1900s. And this is our DeLorean, only without Michael J. Fox. I sort of wish I could time travel this tour right to the end right now. Anyway, we're going to visit some of the places in San Diego where Ellen went. And along the way, I'm going to show you some of the art from our museum. Now, Miss Ellen didn't drive. So her favorite baby brother, George, not George, E.W., the Scripps newspaper tycoon, bought her a car, and he even gave her a chauffeur. His name was George. And George was always at her disposal. I need you to put on your masks and fasten your seatbelts because you're probably in for literally a bumpy ride. There were no freeways back in the early part of the 20th century, mostly unpaved roads. But Miss Ellen loved car rides. And her motto on the open road was, the faster, the better. Next slide. Thank you. We're starting out right now in La Jolla. And this is Ellen's original house, the one that Eric told you burned down. Look at the view she has. And Ellen was born in 1836 in London. Queen Victoria hadn't even started ruling when she was born, but she was born on South Moulton Street. And that's why she named the La Jolla house South Moulton Villa. And enjoy this photo because I've never seen another one, especially since the house is gone. She called that house her seaside cottage. Okay, we're going to the next slide. She then enlisted Irving Gill, who was a noted San Diego architect, to design a replacement for the home. And Eric also showed you this. I'm not giving you a test on this, but her father was a bookbinder. He was from a wealthy publishing company. He married his cousin. They had 2 children. One of them died and the wife died in childbirth. So then a few months later, or maybe it was a couple years later, he married again, and he married a woman named Ellen. She had 6 children. One of the children died. The second child in the family was also Ellen. And this is our Ellen Scripps that we're learning about today. Dad became bankrupt. He was a bankrupt bookbinder. And so he decided to take the whole family to Illinois with relatives, and they lived on a farm. And he married again. And this woman had 6 children. No, she had 5 children. And the youngest one is E.W. He's the one who's Ellen's favorite brother all through their lives. He was the brother from another mother. And I want you to know all this because I wanted you to see where Ellen fit in with her siblings. She also is one of the oldest girls, if not the oldest girl. And you know what happens when you're on a farm and you've got 11 other siblings, you're pretty much in charge of them. You probably are cleaning and helping mom and your stepmom, and you're probably cooking and milking the cows, and you don't have and babysitting. You have a lot to do. And it was amazing that she was able to go to college. So let's take a look at the next one. And
Kathy, I think that sound is in your background. Could you close the door behind you?
Thank you, David. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna just run over here. Sorry. Courtney, it's too loud. It's way too loud. Okay. Oh God. I'm so sorry. No, I have my daughter here visiting. So, and she's working from home.
This is COVID time.
Yes, exactly. Anyway, so this is a museum of contemporary art, and I wish I had a side-by-side photo, because do you see the facade of that? It's really the same as Ellen's house, and I think it's really neat that they brought that in there. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to drive by the La Jolla Women's Club, which Ellen founded in, I think it was about 1894. She said that La Jolla was full of women, married women, single women, divorced women, and all of them faced a number of issues like the right to vote, or maybe to have legal custody of their children. So she enlisted Irving Gill, once again, to design a place where they could meet. And that's what they did. They gathered and they discussed a lot of issues. Ellen became the first president of the club, and the La Jolla Women's Club nowadays does the same thing. They host meetings, they host also weddings and lectures and nonprofit fundraisers and even celebrations of life. Let's take a look. We're driving by the Bishop School. And the Bishop School is another contribution of Ellen's. Again, she wanted her friend Irving Gill to design it. And you can see how some of these similarities are like her house and other buildings around. You'll see so many of his work that's left even now. Now the Bishop School started out as a boarding school for just women. And her sister, Virginia, and she donated the money for the school, and mostly the land and then the building. Okay, let's go ahead to the next one. So it's 1924, and she is recovering from a broken hip, and she's in a very poorly equipped sanitarium in La Jolla. And she was determined to build the finest hospital she could for this part of the world that she had really come to love. And that's how Scripps Memorial Hospital was founded, right here on Prospect Street. And of course, it relocated to Genesee. And I know many of us have been to Scripps Memorial for some reason or another, maybe to have a baby or have a knee replacement or something like that. She also founded, Eric mentioned, the Scripps Metabolic Clinic, that's now the Scripps Clinic. And that was in 1924. And I think she was quite an amazing woman. Okay, next slide. All right, we're on our way to Balboa Park. We see a painting by Charles Fries, who was one of the first of San Diego's plein air artists. And there was a California Impressionism movement going on throughout the state. And painters focused on capturing the unique light and the varied terrains that defined our Golden State. And Fries was intent on capturing a scene just as it was. And the plein air technique meant going outdoors, painting in the open air. You can see Coronado in this painting, and Point Loma is in the background. Next slide. Oh, let's swing by Balboa Park to see what's going on. We're going to cross the Cabrillo Bridge, or I call it the Laurel Street Bridge, looking towards the West Gate. And notice the dome and the bell tower that they're just rising up into the sky. That's the California State Building then. And I read that Ellen paid for those. Okay, let's go in and see what's happening over the bridge. Oh my gosh, it looks like the Panama, California Expo is on. We're actually there. It's 1915 and we have to buy a guidebook, and look at how much it costs. This guidebook was really interesting. I really wanted to show you more things, but just in the interest of time, I didn't feel that I should. Inside the first page is a list of the movers and shakers of names that we still recognize, like Burnham and Spreckles and other names. And they were responsible for having this happen in our city. We only had 40,000 people in San Diego then. This is something that put San Diego on the map, and newspapers dubbed it our dream city. Balboa Park has been threatened, it has been saved, it has been restored and reconstructed over the years, and it's still going on now. And this is such a great example of Dr. Eric's discussion on cultural sustainability. Let's go on. This is the plaza, our plaza that we see every day when we walk out the door of the museum. It's looking 4 ways, and visitors could go northwest, east, or south. The buildings in the expo, there were lots of different buildings, and there were a lot of vendors, and we can see how many people already were gathered. The Museum of Man, the San Diego Museum of Art, and the San Diego Zoo were direct outgrowths of the expo. In fact, the Museum of Man, or I guess I have to call it us now, still displays expo art and artifacts that can be seen in that building that Eric showed you. And I'm sure that Miss Ellen was likely here in Balboa Park visiting the expo. And as locals, we treasure Balboa Park, and it remains one of San Diego's top tourist attractions. Let's go to a small watercolor. Nick. And it's by a man named Colin Campbell Cooper. Don't you love the alliteration? And he paints just like his name. It's very elegant. I found this, I've never seen it in the museum, but I found it in the collection. I wanted you to see it. It's really the only thing we have by him, and I wanted so much for you to meet him. He's such an elegant painter, and in this he has very light colors. This is a small little 8 by 11 watercolor, but it's of the lily pond, and the buildings behind it you can see are in that Spanish colonial style architecture. I had to put this in, and the next one, thank you, the next slide. And if you have an iPad, you'll have a hard time reading this, but I just particularly wanted to put it in. I thought the docents would get a kick out of this. It's a list of art for sale. It's in that guide, and that you could buy for 25 cents. And it was in the Fine Arts Building, and the Fine Arts Building is what became the San Diego Museum of Art. But if you read the names, they're names like George Lukes and William Glackens and Penne Dubois, Child Hassam, John Sloan. You see all these names, and you see Robert Henright. And Robert Henright, most of these fellows were taught by Robert Henright, and he was an advocate of realism, and he believed that an artist also must be a social force. So I want you to see on the next page, we'll see one by him that he painted. I think if that guide was 25 cents, I was thinking, I wondered how much those paintings were. Were really worth a fortune right now. And I didn't know that artists like that sold their work in our expo in 1915. Anyway, Robert Henright painted his wife, and he painted her here in San Diego. He gave the painting to Alice Klauber, who was a La Jolla resident, and she was also an artist, and she was a student of his and a friend. And then some years later, she gave the museum the painting. Maybe she didn't give it some years later, because I see I put 1914 on it. Anyway, let's go to the Nat. the NAT, this is the Natural History Museum. And this is the one, it started way back in the 1800s, but that one burned down and they built another one. And this is the one that they built. And it's back in the day, but Ellen and her sister, Virginia, were very, very active there. And they donated a lot of money to fund the building. And that is a beautiful museum. They also gave 2,000 paintings by A.B. Valentine of his nature watercolors of California wildflowers. They were exquisite. And Valentine came from pottery and was also an artist. And we have some things of his in pottery, but I didn't feel like I should show you those. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. Balboa Park is in its infancy, and the San Diego Museum didn't open until 1926. And I like to think that Ellen walked in our galleries, but by then she was 90 years old and she died 6 years later. But maybe her chauffeur, George, brought her in. I've never seen this painting in our collection, but it's the lily pond in the park. And I think it's really a beautiful oil. Next one. Thank you. Here's Charles Fries again. Maybe Ellen played croquet in the park. Many of these eucalyptus trees could still be there. Fries was called the professor because he wore a white lab coat and he rode his bike around San Diego painting scenes. I think it's time now to leave our beautiful park and drive to the back country. First, we have to drive along the road to Mission Valley. Mission Valley was filled with dairy farms, and it looks like maybe there was a storm, and Maurice has just finished painting it. He was the first of our San Diego Impressionists, and he was the teacher of Charles Fries and a couple others I'm going to show you. Let's go to the next slide. Well, it's sunny now. And here's a Maurice Braun painting, probably in Mission Valley. And some people refer to him as the founder of the Eucalyptus School. Next one. You can see what I mean by a bumpy ride. Maurice Braun painted this. Look at that narrow, dusty road beckoning us onward. That's where we're going. Next one. Next, thank you. We are now seeing Charlie Rifle. He's been busy at work. This is called in the San Felipe Valley, which is an inland valley, and there's actually a protected wildlife area there. We may want to stop and drink from that water in the left bottom because the weather's gotten much warmer out here. Rifle is known as a California Impressionist, and this is a good example of his style. Bold color, thick sweeping brushstrokes. I think Miss Ellen might have liked this one. Rifle was frequently seen on the back roads of San Diego, painting the hills, farms, and countryside. He and his wife loved San Diego so much that when they visited here, they were so enchanted with the area, they decided to make it their home. I am so happy they did. I want you to meet, in our next slide, Alfred Mitchell. Alfred Mitchell was the baby of the San Diego group of the 4 California Impressionists. He studied at the San Diego Academy of Art under Maurice Braun, but later He played a leading role as a popular art teacher himself. His palette is usually bright, like rifles. The brilliant sunlight of Southern California and the long hours of warmth in June, from June to October, and we certainly know warmth here right now this year, with the occasional balmy May, increase the amount of time in which the plein air artist could paint outside. And the paint was quickly applied because the mood of the moment was fleeting. And light and the technique influenced each other. And you can see how Rifle and Mitchell's techniques have this illumination on the landscape. Let's go to the next. We're going to be driving west, and we're going north going through Santee on Fanita Road. We're driving by Carlton Oaks. I'm sorry, I don't have a map. I didn't know how to do one. We're on our way to Scripps Ranch, and all this Santee property is part of the ranch that EW bought. It was about 2,500 acres. And remember, he was the one who was Ellen's favorite brother. After the Civil War, land was divided and it was sold to people like him. And it was he who named the area Miramar, meaning view of the sea. Mira, look, mar, sea, Miramar. Really something, that was something, we think that it's Spanish, but he was thinking more of this place in Spain he wanted to call Miramar because it was a Spanish castle. And that's what he wants to construct, is this castle. For you, if you have a big screen, this isn't great. But I just wanted you to see this old photo, and it's not clear, but it's quite old. And he and Ellen, get this, they bought 500 acres for which they paid $25 an acre. They were really very shrewd business people also. And the land was predominantly used for grazing and farming in the early 20th century. Let's go to the next photo, and you can see the view also. You see this little carriage, this little horse and buggy going up. Maybe Ellen's in it, and it's winding on up, and it ends up with that vague little unclear, some kind of a little castle up at the top. He planted about 2,500 eucalyptus. He planted orange groves, and really it was quite something for a few years. But he was looking for a place that he could go to relax from the busy life that he had as this newspaperman. And it was 1890. The family, he brings the whole family out, and they all loved the weather, but they hated the rattlesnakes. They hated the coyotes and the varmints and the dirt. And so after about 5 years, they made him leave, and they all went back east. But Ellen is the one who stayed, and she built her home, the one that I showed you at the beginning that burned down. She built that in La Jolla, and then her sister Virginia stayed, and she bought the cottage that we know in La Jolla called the Wisteria Cottage. And that was right near Ellen's home. Let's go on. EW commissioned Arthur Putnam. He was a San Diego sculptor, a young one, and he did mostly bronze. And he was a lover of animals, and he wanted him to sculpt some animals for him. He wanted these giant mountain lions in the front of his house, and they're stunning, but they're not from our collection, and I don't have pictures. I do have this coyote, but the coyote's not very big. They're really pretty small, these little animals. You're going to see another one next right now. This dog gnawing a bone. Arthur Putnam had a way with sculpting animals. You really can see all of the muscles, and it's just, he does such a nice job with each animal that he takes on. They all look like sort of whimsical. Okay, now we have the bronze from Ellen that you've already seen, and those are 3 from our museum. Okay, I want to go to the next slide, and that is one of the newest places in San Diego that's named for Ellen. It's the Ellen Browning Scripps Elementary School. They call it EBS. It sort of sounds like something in your digestion or something, but that's fine. They are so good. They pride themselves on the ideals of Ellen's. And this was started in 2002 in Scripps Ranch. But I've never seen penguins before as the mascots. It's kind of ironic because San Diego is so sunny. Let's go to one more. Oh my, we just learned that Miss Ellen is on the cover of Time magazine. And this is a really big deal. As we look at it, I want you to look at the date. The date is February 22nd, 1926. Time started in 1922. Even I wasn't born then. This honor was all for her philanthropy. And she was 90 years young when this happened to her. Eric said she had an English accent. She was very petite. She had a slight accent all the way up to living. I thought maybe she'd get some kind of a surfer accent, but she never did. Time dubbed her the most beloved woman in Southern California. That's such an honor. How about going on? You're probably wondering what in the world this is doing here. Well, I'm throwing this in, and I'm sort of glad that Eric talked about this. He mentioned James, the one with the gun, and the bad boy. He mentioned that James had founded part of the Detroit Art Museum. Well, here I am. I'm just down the rabbit hole when you do these kind of presentations, and I somehow I started thinking about Bougreau because we had an exhibit in last year and the first part of this year of William Bougreau in America. And it was all about the Gilded Age and how self-made millionaires during that time would have art collections. And when they had their art collections and when they were ready to get rid of them, they would sometimes give them to a museum, or else they'll pass them down in the family. But this exhibit was filled with Bougreau's paintings from various museums and collections. And it was a wonderful a wonderful exhibit. We really loved it. And so here I am looking at the Detroit Art Museum, and guess who I find donated this one, the Nut Gatherers. And it was James the bad boy. I thought this was so special when I found it, and I wanted to show it to the docents because we enjoyed the show so much. But also any of you who have come into the museum to see this. Okay, we're going on, and we've just had enough gas now, I think, to drive 2 more places. We're heading further west a bit and over to Torrey Pines. We're going to the Torrey Pines State Natural Reserve. And this is the home to one of our nation's rarest pine trees. It's the Pinus torreana. And it only grew here and on Santa Rosa Island off the coast near Santa Barbara. And the park preserves, the park preserves not only the trees, but also there's a great salt marsh and there's a waterfowl refuge in Southern California. The oil painting you're looking at is by Nikolai Fetchin. And to protect, well, these are the cliffs and the plants in the area. I don't see a Torrey pine exactly, but to protect the unique and rare Torrey pine tree for future generations, Ellen Scripps purchased a tract of land and she gave it to the state with the provision that the parcel remain undeveloped forever. There's another example of cultural sustainability. Now we're heading south back to La Jolla. Our journey is almost at an end. I want you to see a photo of half-sister Virginia. Ellen is in the middle, and there's their bachelor brother, George. George loved the ocean and learning about the ocean. And when he died, he left Ellen for $500,000. So Ellen founded the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in George's memory. Let's go on. We've come full circle and in our journey right now, and we are right here in La Jolla. We started in La Jolla and we're ending in La Jolla. I didn't run out of gas. We didn't have a car wreck. We didn't have a flat tire. And I know you're tired. So I hope you might consider walking down those steps of this painting. And I know you want to take off your shoes. You can do that. You can even take off some of your clothes. And I want you to know that this is by our beloved Alfred Mitchell. Alfred Mitchell painted this in such an inviting way. And he almost wants us to walk into that water. If you look around the corner over on the right, you'll see the children's pool. Let's take a look at that. This is Miss Ellen's last great gift to La Jolla in 1931. And she wanted a seawall. She wanted someone to design and build it. She got William Templeton, and he's the one who built our San Diego Museum of Art. She really wanted those children to be safe. And now, almost 90 years later, I sort of regret to say that the landmark is really not children anymore, but the children are the seals, and it's become a place of controversy. For those of you who don't live here, you need to know that the seals have taken over, and it's not the US Navy seals either, but the real mammals, and they're still making headlines in the newspapers. If you look back a little behind that corner, then that's where Miss Ellen lived in her home on Prospect Street for 35 years until the end of her life at age 96 in 1932. Next to the last one, thank you. So undoubtedly, living in San Diego gave Miss Ellen great happiness, and she gave back tenfold. Our city has had many generous benefactors, and I hope we have many more. But will there ever be another like Ellen Scripps? I want to leave you with something to consider. How can we follow in her footsteps and keep San Diego a treasured place? Thank you all for coming to the museum tour. And I hope to see you in real life after COVID is over. Don't be a stranger. Bye now.
Thank you all so much for coming.